Let's open our Bibles today to the second chapter of the book of Nehemiah. While Nehemiah was carrying his great burden for the people and the conditions in Jerusalem, he began the tough job of rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem by getting on his knees, asking God for compassion and understanding in the heart of King Artaxerxes. Today we will see God's gracious answer to that prayer of Nehemiah, and how God launched an incredible reconstruction project. However, before we read the passage, I want to comment on the obvious, the great theological tension between God's sovereignty and our human responsibility. Some ask, is God really sovereign? The answer, of course, is yes. Well, the other question, are we really responsible to act? Another, absolutely yes. But we can stretch this tension between divine sovereignty and human responsibility to its breaking point if we try to fully comprehend the power of prayer as it relates to God's predetermined plan. Today, from the life of Nehemiah, we will learn what he learned, that problem projects and problem people stand within the jurisdiction of our sovereign God. God can soften the hardest heart in answer to the prayers of his saints. And when he does that, we must be ready and willing to act, to step forward based on faith, to begin to accomplish what the Lord sets before us, regardless of the opposition we're facing. And now follow along as I read for you the first 11 verses of Nehemiah chapter 2. And it came about in the month Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, that wine was before him. And I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence. So the king said to me, "Why is your face sad, though you are not sick? This is nothing but sadness of heart." Then I was very much afraid. I said to the king, "Let the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad when the city, the place of my father's tombs, lies desolate, and its gates have been consumed by fire?" Then the king said to me, "What would you request?" So I prayed to the God of heaven. I said to the king, "If it please the king, and if your servant has found favor before you, send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it." Then the king said to me, the queen sitting beside him, "How long will your journey be? And when will you return?" So it pleased the king to send me, and I gave him a definite time. And I said to the king, "If it please the king, let letters be given me for the governors of the provinces beyond the river, that they may allow me to pass through until I come to Judah. And a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the fortress, which is by the temple, for the wall of the city, and for the house to which I will go." And the king granted them to me, because the good hand of my God was on me. Then I came to the governors of the provinces beyond the river, and gave them the king's letters. Now the king had sent with me officers of the army and horsemen. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard about it, it was very displeasing to them that someone had come to seek the welfare of the sons of Israel. So I came to Jerusalem and was there 3 days.
The official title of this morning's message is Preparation for a Tough Job. The subtitle could be How to Get Along with Your Boss. or how to live happily with an unfair superior. So I'd like to dedicate the message to three different kinds of people here this morning, all of whom are represented. Those of you that have had trouble with your boss in the past, those of you that are now having trouble, and those of you that have plans in the immediate future to have trouble with your boss. And some of you are not employed, and therefore I must say this would apply to any stratum of society. If you're a student, it could be your teacher. If you're a teacher, it could be your principal. Your principal, it could be the superintendent. If you're in the military, it could be your commanding officer. If you're in some Christian work, it could be the founder or president or your immediate superior. Whoever it may be, it applies. If you're not working, it could be your parent. I made the statement in the early service that no matter what area you may live or in which realm you may be working, it is not always easy to work with your superior. And Bill said, amen. To which I replied, as I put the book that the young lady sang from a moment ago under my breath, I thought, well, there are other things that could be said, but I won't say them. And at the time, I turned over the glass of water that was sitting under this, and the water drained on my shoes through the first service, and the water drained in the plugs underneath here, and had kind of a shocking time during the early morning service. So I think God didn't want me to say anything back to Bill. Now, whatever may be your realm of work, you have come to the problem that we're going to be talking about this morning, and that is facing a difficulty with your superior. How do you handle it? I want to begin by reminding you of the motto we gave from Hudson Taylor's pen last Sunday. It goes like this: it is possible to move men through God by prayer alone. That appropriately fits all that I have to say today. You will come to the place where you will face the impossible inevitability that you cannot change your boss. The only answer that God has for you at that point is prayer. Let me show you why. Let's come to Nehemiah 2 through the side door. Proverbs 21. Look at the first verse with me from the 21st chapter of Proverbs. This is an interesting proverb for a couple of reasons. First of all, it is a comparative proverb. That is, in the proverb, something is likened to something else. And most comparative proverbs end with the comparison and leave it at that. But this proverb comes to a conclusion in what could be called the declarative part of the proverb. The first part is comparative. The last part is declarative. In other words, it concludes with a timeless principle that is appropriate for any age. Look at first the comparison. The king's heart is like channels of water in the hand of the Lord. The Hebrew sentence doesn't begin with the king's heart, but begins with the word channels. But the original term does not mean channels. Originally, the verb means to split into several parts, to divide. And in noun form, it has reference to small ditches that move from a main reservoir of water out into flat lands that need to be filled with water. They are thirsty. We call these irrigation ditches or canals. Like irrigation canals carrying water is the heart of the king in Jehovah's hand, the original says. What does it mean? Well, the source of all decisions in the heart of any superior is his heart. And the writer says that heart that breathes out and communicates decisions and attitudes, that heart is in the Lord's hand. Just as if God would say, the main source of water that feeds the flatlands, that main source is in Jehovah's hand. In other words, wherever it may go, God is involved in the direction. Now look at the declaration. After the comparison, he declares something. He turns it wherever he wishes. He, meaning not the king, but Jehovah. Capital H is correct. Because the Lord has in his hand the heart of a king. Whether he is saved or not isn't important as far as this proverb is concerned. He, the Lord, because he has the king's heart in his hand, bends it literally, and it's in causative stem, and so it means he causes it to be bent wherever he is pleased. So putting it all together, it would read like this. Like irrigation canals carrying water, so is the heart of the king in Jehovah's hand. He causes it to bend and incline in whatever direction he pleases. Now, what is true of the king is true of your superior. The first one we have to become acquainted with and impressed by is Jehovah. The Lord has the heart of your superior in his hand. Nehemiah chapter 2 is a beautiful illustration of that truth. Now that proverb in 21:1 is a perfect prelude for Nehemiah 2, because Nehemiah worked under a man who was the king of Persia. We don't know a lot about Persia, but we have a saying in America that goes like this. Don't try to change it. It's like the law of the Medes and the Persians. Meaning what? Meaning it's impossible to change it. Now, Artaxerxes was the king of the Medes and the Persians. In other words, he was, like so many of them, he was impossible to change. Nehemiah worked for him. He worked under him, as the last verse of the previous chapter says. He was the cupbearer. He served the king his meals. He tasted them to be sure they were not poisoned. He was in the intimate part of the king's life in that he was able to frequent the private chambers of the king, as we see him in this place in chapter 2. But Nehemiah's heart was not in Persia, though he was there physically. His heart was in Jerusalem. He wanted to go back and rebuild those walls. But he couldn't just leave his job. God had to work through the heart of the king. And because Nehemiah knew the only way to move Artaxerxes God's way was to pray for him, then most of the previous chapter has been a prayer. Look at verse 11 of the previous chapter. Lord, I beseech thee, may thine ear be attentive to the prayer of thy servant and the prayer of thy servants who delight to revere thy name. Now look at the request. And make thy servant successful today, and grant him compassion before this man. I was the cupbearer to the king. Lord, I ask you to change the heart of the king move those events in his life, change the situation so that I might be allowed to do your will with his pleasure. That is, the pleasure of my superior. He didn't rashly run to Jerusalem. He laid it before God. Will you look right after the period in verse 11? To the first word in chapter 2, verse 1, there is a space, a blank space. That's precisely what happened after he prayed. Nothing. In fact, you look at verse 1 and you'll see how long nothing happened as far as Nehemiah was concerned. It came about in the month Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes. Hold your place and go back a page to verse 1 of chapter 1. I want to show you something. Now it happened in the month Chislev, in the 20th year, while I was in Susa, the capital. Chapter 2, verse 1. It came about in the month Nisan, in the 20th year. Chislev is December. Nisan is April. What am I saying? 4 months of waiting. That's what we're saying. Nothing happened. Have you ever had that experience? It's the most disillusioning thing in the world. You hear on Sunday the preacher says, pray to God, give him this situation. And so you go home and you pray. You know, the favorite American prayer, Lord, give me patience, and I want it now. And so you lay before the Lord this situation. Lord, here's this situation. Take care of it. Monday morning, nothing has changed. A month from then, nothing has changed. Lord, are you awake? Do you hear me? Another month passes, and another month. That's what Nehemiah experienced. Hand in hand with the prayer warrior is the patience of waiting. And so he was. That kind of man. In this diary that he has kept, nothing has been entered in these 4 months because nothing has happened. He's waited. Now let's look further. It was in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes that wine was before him. And I took up the wine and gave it to the king. I think the Living Bible puts it so well. One day in April, 4 months later. And here he was in this familiar situation. The king and his queen were lying together and reclining together and finishing their meal, and the sumptuous delight and the smell of this delicious meal was all over, and he poured them some of their favorite vintage from the vine, and he brought it to them. And it says, I took up the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence. Now that is remarkable. You know how you can tell people that want you to know they've been praying a long time? Look at them. They want to show you how very spiritual they are, and they show it in their face, usually a long face. Whatever may be called it, a spiritual look. They usually wear that face. Now, Nehemiah didn't have that face. For 4 months he didn't have that face. That's incredible, isn't it? I mean, we wait 3 or 4 hours and we've got the face worked out to a special kind of look so that nobody can doubt that we are really in prayer about something. Nehemiah left it with the Lord, said, Lord, take over. At your timing, I'm going to rest it with you. And he says, I had not been sad in the presence of the king. Now, maybe this was Blue Monday. And nobody's perfect. Everybody has a breaking point. And Nehemiah had come to the place where he had just begun to wonder, is it going to happen? So he was sort of sad when he served them the wine. And the king said to him, why is your face sad? Though you're not sick, this is nothing but sadness of heart. Then I was very much afraid. I appreciate the honesty of Nehemiah. Most people, when they become leaders, will no longer admit their human weaknesses, not Nehemiah. He says, when the king said that to me, I was scared. Why was he afraid? Well, for one thing, when you're sad in the presence of the king of Persia, you usually are killed for it. So That was one thing that would probably lead him to be a little bit afraid. And then there were other things that were heavy on his heart. He was sad. Benjamin Disraeli has said this: everything comes if one will only wait for it. And Nehemiah perhaps had begun to question Disraeli's words as he began to work again, the beginning of the 5th month. And the king says, "Why are you sad?" Now, will you notice the interchange in these verses? Look at verse 2. The king said. Verse 3, I said. Verse 4, the king said. Verse 5, I said. Verse 6, the king said. Verse 7, I said. Interesting message, isn't it? Back and forth, back and forth. It's like reading a play where the one who is speaking has his name underlined, and then he has his line. And then the next one has his line. It's a diary. Nehemiah's recording for us in his journal that has now been preserved through time exactly what took place back and forth. But what is interesting is that before his lines are given, he tells us the feelings. But he didn't know the feeling of the king. All he could give us were the king's words. So you have the king's words, and then his feelings, and then his words. Then the king's response, his feelings, and then his line. Look at it again. The king said to me, verse 2, "Why is your face sad, though you're not sick?" This is nothing but sadness of heart. I was very much afraid. There are his feelings. Read those feelings into that next verse. That's why he puts them there. I said to the king, "Let the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad when the city, the place of my father's tombs, lies desolate, and its gates have been consumed by fire? Why shouldn't I be afraid? Why shouldn't I be sad?" Verse 4, then the king said to me, "What would you request?" That's the greatest moment in Nehemiah's life for the last 4 months. That's what you call an open door, that God is open. And Nehemiah instantly prayed. He asked, I'm sure, for wisdom in knowing what words to use, how to express his desire to the king. By the way, have you ever been in the midst of answered prayer? You know, you prayed and waited and prayed and waited and waited, and then finally the door is flung open. And there's a moment that you stand there and you just can't believe it. And so at that moment you say, "Oh God, this is such a critical point. Help me to take these steps very, very carefully." That's precisely where Nehemiah was. God had thrown the door open. What is it that you'd request? You see, the king's heart is in the hands of Jehovah. And God had adjusted the thinking of the king so that he was wide open. What do you want, Nehemiah? What's worth getting sad over? And so I prayed. And with a prayerful tone, he responds. Verse 5, "If it please the king, and if your servant has found favor before you, send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it." Now, that's the statement, that's the answer, that's the request. He had asked it of the Lord, and then he said, "Change the heart of the king." 4 months later, the king says, "What do you want?" He names it before the king. Now look at the response. Beautiful. The king said to me, the queen sitting beside him. Why in the world did he add that? Makes you wonder, doesn't it? It's not really the Hebrew word for queen. It's a word that means a close, intimate friend, a contact, or consort, one of those words. And maybe she leaned over and said something. Maybe he talked with her. But anyway, the response is, "How long will your journey be? And when will you return?" The last part of verse 6 says, "I gave him a definite time." This tells me, first of all, that they didn't want him to go. He was doing a good job. His attitude was still positive toward being a cupbearer. And that's a rare, rare person. When your heart is somewhere else, it is really hard to do a job where you are. And some of you are already nodding in agreement. That's where you are perhaps right now. Your heart isn't where you're working, it's somewhere else. But for 4 months, he had faithfully done his job. So the king didn't say, man, I've been looking for a way to get rid of you. Thank God. Go on to Jerusalem. He said, when will you come back? Look at this marvelous response. I gave him a definite time. Oh, that's great. I weary of people that call it faith when they can't tell you their plan. Have you seen an individual who said, no, we're not going to think through this. Let's just go by faith. Let's just go on our own, God will lead us. And the calculating businessman says, yeah, you'll be back needing more before you're halfway there. What is your plan? Oh, I don't have a plan. I haven't thought it through. God's led me. I gave him a definite time. You know that God loves and honors order and organization. Can you imagine what he had thought through on the spot to say, you want to know how long it'll take me? It'll take me this long. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Because you see, Nehemiah had a plan. He had been doing more than praying for 4 months. He had been planning. There's a proverb that says, a man's heart devises his way, plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps. Going out by faith doesn't mean you go out in a disordered or haphazard fashion. You think through it. Listen to Jesus' words. Don't begin to build until you count the cost. For who would begin construction of a building without first getting estimates and then checking to see if he has enough money to pay the bills? Jesus said this. Christ said this. Before you build, check out your plan. Otherwise, he might complete only the foundation before he runs out of funds, and then everyone would laugh. See that fellow there? They would mock. He started that building and ran out of money before it was finished. Unquote. That's Luke 14, 28 to 30 in the Living Bible. What a beautiful expression of exactly what Nehemiah had done. When will you come back? He gave him a definite time. I want to pause and say something else. It is of great concern to me that so many people who enter the Lord's work enter without careful planning, or enter a project without thinking through, where will this lead us? For what must we trust God? How can I express this in clear, unmistakable, concrete terms? I could name on both hands the number of individuals and or families I know that entered the ministry in some work of God, but today they've left it because they didn't plan on what it would cost. The most disillusioned and discouraged people I know today are those in the Lord's work who pay the price for not thinking through the plan. You know, William Carey, the great missionary to India and various parts, practical-minded man, said this, I will go down if you will hold the ropes. And then he spelled out the ropes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Nehemiah says that, and I think people could read this thinking that he's presumptuous. He's not presumptuous. He's practical. King Artaxerxes says, fine, you may go. Now, wait a minute, King, before I leave. A couple other things I want to talk about. Verse 7. If it please the king, I like the way he starts, always very gracious. If it please the king, let letters be given me for the governors of the provinces beyond the river. Who were they? Well, they were people that were going to stop him in his plan. So he says, now, King, I'll tell you, I've got the okay, but I need a little more than that. When I get a little further outside this area, I'm going to run into some people that don't want me to travel across their land. It'll be great to have a letter from King Artaxerxes that says I can go. Would you send those? Yes. He says a little later, I'll send them. Well, Now there's something else, he says. Look at verse 8. A letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest. You know how tight Asaph is. When I get over there and I need timber to build what needs to be built in Jerusalem, he won't let it go. Would you send a letter that says to Asaph, you can take the timber from the king's forest? Verse 8 says that. And a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber. What do you need timber for? I've got it thought through. First, I need to make beams for the gates of the fortress which is by the temple, and for the wall of the city, and for the house to which I will go. What's he asking? He's asking for timber to build himself a house. I think that's fantastic. That is a practical mind. You see, during these 4 months of waiting, he was doing more than praying. He was planning. The old Revolutionary War veterans used to say, trust in God, but keep your powder dry. Pray to God, but make your plans. Set your sights. Think through the hurdles. So many of God's people in God's work are short-sighted. And then when they come to the first fellow outside the province of Susa, and the guy says, where are you going? Well, I was hoping by faith to go over here. Well, where's your letters? I ain't got any letters. Well, go back and get them. So he goes back and he starts all over. But can't you picture Nehemiah riding out of the city of Susa? He gets to the first guy. Where are you going? The letter from the king. Who wrote it? Artaxerxes, right there. See it? Sign right there of Artaxerxes. Oh, man, go on through. And it gets down to Asaph. Asaph, probably negative thinker. What do you want? I want some timber. Only by requisition. Artaxerxes requisitioned me to have all the timber I want. What? And he checks it out. Perfect planning. And God honors that kind of thinking. This is a great place to stop and say something else. At times my heart goes out to the layman, who is, in my opinion, the silent hero of the ministry. Some dear godly family or person says, the Lord's calling me to the work. And who does the Lord lead that godly Christian to? Some fella in business, some layman. And he taps him for some help, and he goes to another and another. And you've got to. If it weren't for the layman, the ministry would fold from a material point of view. But the remarkable thing is when he gets on the field and fantastic things happen, he never mentions the layman. Always back behind the scenes, there's this layman shelling out, providing what he needs. I'm reminded of Richard Halverson's words in his preface to his book, Perspective. He says this: I dedicate my book to faithful Christian laymen who, with silent heroism, under relentless secular pressure, fight the economic battle as stewards of the living God. Thank God upon every remembrance of these faithful men and women. The silent heroes of this pulpit are not those that stand behind it. They're those that support it. And of this church and of every mission endeavor, the silent hero is the fellow that never gets to the field, but says to the fellow that's gifted, I'll stand behind you. Campuses are blitzed across America and across the world. Behind the scenes, there are laymen that say, I'll stand behind you. No mention, no attention drawn on me, but I'll stand behind you. And Christian workers are spread like tentacles, like irrigation canals, that God directs and moves, because there are the Artaxerxes that faithfully stand behind it. I need letters. I need your good graces. I will go down if you will hold the ropes. And he held the ropes. Look at the response. I love this. The response is given to us in verse 6 and verse 8. The last part of verse 6 says, so it pleased the king to send me. Artaxerxes had to send him. God was on Nehemiah's side. It was just a matter of time. And so Artaxerxes says, fine, you may go. But does he stop there? Verse 8 concludes with the sentence, and the king granted them to him. Granted what? The letters. Sure, Nehemiah, wait a minute, I'll write those out right now. He wrote out the letters. He signed it. But will you notice Nehemiah's insight? Notice the reason behind the response. The good hand of my God was on me. 4 months of silence. Nobody applauding Nehemiah. But in the solitude of that secret place, he faithfully bombarded the throne. Lord, send me to Jerusalem. Change the heart of the king that I can go. And it says in the last part of verse 8, yeah, I got to go because the good hand of my God was on me. I'll tell you, when the Lord has His hand on certain individuals, it's like a sweeping wind as people are moved to respond. The Lord's hand was on Nehemiah, and off he went, excited as he could be. Look at him en route, verse 9. I came to the governors of the provinces beyond the river. There they are, see. He knew he'd come to them. And what did he do? He gave them the letters. What a joy. Gave them the king's letters. Now the king had sent with me officers of the army and horsemen. Look at that, over and above. I'll not only send letters, I'll not only send you the okay to use my timber, I'll dispatch a few horsemen and a few soldiers, and they can go right along with you to protect you on your way. Gracious response of the king, because his heart is in the hand of Jehovah. He bent it wherever he pleased. And will you notice? Not only was Nehemiah in the crest of ecstasy, delight, but he came across a couple of fellows in verse 10 that we will run across again and again and again throughout the book. Look at them. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard about it, it was very displeasing to them that someone had come to seek the welfare of the sons of Israel. Opposition. When you walk by faith, you will invariably encounter the Sanballats and the Tobiahs, people who live by Murphy's Law. If you've read the Peter prescription, you have come across Murphy's Law, which says, it won't work, quote unquote. There are people who live by that principle. Their whole life is one big negative. There's a critical spirit that just surveys and covers them, and whatever may come to their attention, it won't work. Sanballat and Tobiah heard about his coming and said, oh, no. You see, they were into those people for, I'm sure, a lot of cash. And what's he going to do? He's going to build a wall around the city. Oh, no! That's not good. And as we will see next Sunday, they made plans to oppose God's arrangement. When you walk by faith, you will encounter the hostility of people who walk by sight. They are rebuked by the life of faith. They are especially rebuked because they don't have it. And Sanballat and Tobiah heard of this, and they were disturbed. You see, criticism and opposition doesn't mean you're out of the will of God. As a matter of fact, it may reinforce the fact that you're in the will of God. Finally, it says in verse 11 that he changes hats. No longer the cupbearer, he now begins to be the construction engineer, the builder. I came to Jerusalem, and I was there 3 days. What were you doing? We don't know. But knowing Nehemiah, he was probably back before God, seeking further direction. Let me leave with you 4 timeless principles that I think are so appropriate with what we have learned this morning. Changing a heart is God's specialty, no matter how important the person may be. seems as though God specializes in people that are the most stubborn. Changing the heart of stubborn people, no matter how important they may be, is God's specialty. And let me add at this point, don't try to do it yourself. Don't try to manipulate them. Don't try to play games or work out schemes or trick them or deceive them. We've got individuals here today living with stubborn mates. Tell God on them. Some of you wives have husbands that are just ornery. They're just not going to change. And they've told you that. Maybe they told you this morning. I'm only going to church one time a Sunday. Well, I want to go back tonight. One time. Okay. And tell God on them. He takes care of that. He's a specialist at situations like that. So you come one time on Sunday. Uh-oh. Didn't hear any amens on that one. That's not too popular. Let God deal with the stubbornness of your mate. Some of you live with individuals. You're single, you live with someone else, and that individual is just really unreal. And how are you going to work with that? You've tried every way in the world. Every manipulative move, it hasn't worked. Tell God on them. Some of you have people in your business, in your school, impossible creatures. God says, let me at him. I can change that person like you can't believe. Now, I'm not going to do it in your time. I'm going to do it in my time. So between now and then, just relax. Don't look spiritual, Like, what are you doing? I'm praying for you, honey, that God will change your life. That's terrible stuff. Just relax. Let God take care of it. That brings us to the second truth we picked up from this, and that's praying and waiting go hand in hand. You haven't really prayed till you've learned to wait. And waiting with release. Abandoning yourself to God's changing the heart of the king. Praying and waiting go hand in hand. The third is faith is not a synonym for disorder or a substitute for careful planning. People of faith have ordered minds, orderly minds. Leaders like Nehemiah think through the situation, though their circumstance may allow them to go only half a step. They've thought through the next 12. Because faith breeds organization. They go together. One of the best things that ever happened to me in a former pastorate was the joy of working with businessmen. So for over 3 years, I added to the responsibilities of my pastorate, working with a group of salesmen who worked for a large corporation in another city. And during these constant encounters, I learned to think a lot more like a businessman thinks, and I learned to appreciate it. Most everything that was brought to a businessman was brought in terms of practical facts, and then we will work in light of that. It was the best thing in the world for this individual. And I learned that God does honor that kind of orderly thinking. That He isn't pleased when we jump off. And on the way down, somehow God's going to have a net along the way. Plan the net. And if God's pleased to jerk it out, that's His planning. Now, there's another, and that is opposition often reinforces the will of God rather than hindering it. It's doubtful that you can really be assured of being in the will of God unless someone vehemently opposes it. I've never seen it fail. Especially people who live by Murphy's Law. Don't you love that guy, Nehemiah? He lives right where we live, doesn't he? Faces financial needs, so he asked the king for letters. He's afraid, So he says, Lord, give me the words to say. He's a man of faith, and yet it's a careful faith. Doesn't have to have it all in his hands, but he's thinking it through. And he's a man of indomitable courage. Think of it. He left all that he knew in Susa, got on his mount, and took off. 800 miles he left. What a great experience. Let's bow together, shall we? Now, the next few moments could be, for some of you, the most important moments of this entire day. Some of you have trouble with your superiors. You have trouble in relational areas. I would venture to say far, far more than have trouble doctrinally. You have trouble submitting. Some of you husbands have trouble submitting to your superiors. You've got pride, and you just won't give up, not even to God. Some of you are involved in a new work, and you've just come across encounters that are discouraging. You're beginning to say, is this really the will of God? Before Nehemiah got off his horse, he was opposed by one person after another. Some of you really do not take the comments concerning a home as a laughing matter because your home situation is desperate today. You live with a tyrant, perhaps, a despot. And God is saying to you, give me the burden. I'm a master at working it out. Now you have the choice this morning in the closing couple of minutes here of giving Him the burden. If you do not know the Lord Jesus Christ, He paid the complete penalty for your sin at the cross. He submitted to the Father's will, and He proved His love when He died for you. He waits for you to receive Him as your personal Savior. We dedicate just these closing moments of silence to some decisions that ought to be made. Let's don't put it off any longer. Let's make the decision right now. Let's leave the burden here with the Lord. Our Father, this morning we have sung that we adore You and that we lay our lives before You. And we've expressed how we love You. That's one thing to sing, and it's another thing entirely to live. Some admittedly live today in intolerable situations. Some of our single friends here, engaged in career work, various kinds, face insurmountable obstacles and pressures. Lord, forever remove from their mind the idea that only those that are engaged in a home with children and wives and husbands are really important to You. Every one of us is important to You. In fact, we never even read of Nehemiah's wife. Perhaps he was alone. But whoever may be here today, Lord, that needs that encouraging word that You have brought, that You change the heart of the king. You cause it to bend wherever You please. Lord, may that message not be forgotten. that you have shared.
In Jesus' name, amen.
The preceding message, Preparation for a Tough Job, was copyrighted in 1974, 1983, 1990, 2006, and 2015, and the sound recording was copyrighted in 2016 by Charles R. Swindoll, Inc. All rights are reserved worldwide. Duplication of copyrighted material for commercial use is strictly prohibited.